Brendon, how about I start with you? Give me your review. How was that?
It was a relatively short speech, 35 minutes, where we heard Bill Clinton nearly go for 50 minutes yesterday. I think by Obama's standards it was a pretty low-key speech. The afterburners were kind of turned down. Obama's soaring speech that he gave in Denver in 2008, I was watching that the other day, and he couldn't start talking for about the first 5 minutes because the crowd was so frenzied. It was a much more grand speech he gave in Denver. So I think it was fairly low-key. For me, there were too many lists. There was kind of a laundry list of activities that his administration had done or were going to do in the future. The high points were, I thought, this set of ideas that he came to about halfway through the speech about talking about Americans being locked together in a notion of citizenship where obligations were shared amongst them, that there were shared obligations. And this kind of ties into his other theme of fairness. It's a basic contrast of two visions, he said. One, he presents his vision as being much fairer, being much more about this sort of serving all Americans, and he presents the other vision as being about a kind of form of Reaganomics, really, that the Republicans are just about reducing taxes, about deregulation, and this is really an argument, I suppose, against an economic approach that you can very much link with Ronald Reagan. I think Mitt Romney in some ways is a continuation of that approach. So those are the two visions, but I think it was a serviceable speech, but I don't think it was a great speech by any stretch.
Tom, how'd that work for you? High points, low points?
I agree with a lot of what Brendon said. I do think on balance it was probably better than Mitt Romney's last week, as we discussed. I think there are two questions here that he needed to deal with today. One was this question that you'll hear over the next 2 months, or you're already hearing it in the course of the last week. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? The classic Reagan line used to great effect against Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. And, you know, all the available evidence, if you look at the facts, suggests not. I mean, look at the debt levels, they've increased from the time of his inauguration at $10 trillion to $16 trillion. The unemployment rate from 7.8% to 8.3%. We'll get jobs figures later tonight for the August month. Gas prices have doubled, and of course the average income has declined from something like 55,000 to 51,000. Now, one can recognise that these are not primarily Barack Obama's faults, and still concede that he is on the political back foot. And I think he failed today to explain satisfactorily how Americans are indeed better off today than they were 4 years ago. The other point I'd make is the other question that he needed to deal with, which was the question that The Economist this week posed on its front cover, which is, one question, Mr. President, what exactly is your second-term agenda? And I would argue that I think it was probably more of the same, redefining the role of the government, entrenching the entitlement state, and I think you'll hear in the course of the next 2 months, Obama and Biden and the Democrats distinguishing themselves from the Romney campaign on this key philosophical question about the role and the size of the state. They'll portray Romney and the Republicans as Mr. Monopoly men without the top hat and cape and cane, who are prepared to protect the rich at the expense of working families. And the Democrats will run on an agenda of the state to help solve problems and to protect a sense of fairness for working families. I think we should also remember that a lot of this, in one of the contrasts between this speech and Romney's speech, Romney's more vacuous remarks last week, was there was more policy detail, there were more goals, but I would remind you that in every State of the Union address since his inauguration in January 2009, it was very similar type of stuff about the goals that were set. Goals such as cutting the deficit in half, dealing with entitlements and debt, and of course, most importantly, reducing unemployment. And you may recall in 2009, he in his mind has unashamedly said that if the stimulus were passed, it would lead to an unemployment rate of 6%. Well, it's gone to 8.3%. It hasn't quite worked as planned. One tick in his favour, you may recall last week I was quite critical of Mitt Romney for failing or placing very little emphasis on foreign policy. I think he probably dedicated the best part of a paragraph, 4 sentences, to foreign policy. He didn't even mention the war in Afghanistan, and that has been a talking point on the campaign in the course of the last week. I think Obama played the foreign policy brilliantly, not just taking credit for the killing of bin Laden and withdrawing troops from Iraq and redefining the war on terror, but also having a few pot shots at Romney over having a Cold War, mind war, particularly when it deals with Russia, to some extent China, and this point about nation building at home. I think that's a point that would resonate with Middle America at a time of deep doubts about America's role in the world and the imperative to reorder priorities in favour of domestic affairs.
Thank you, Tom. Luke, you were in Denver for the convention 4 years ago. How did this speech stack up to, as compared to the one he gave first time he accepted the Democratic nomination for president?
Now you're going to make me remember all the way back then. It was more low-key than that, but even that speech in Denver was already more low-key than address he'd given before. There was already talk that he needed to sort of tone down the celebrity image, and here was really that. The word I keep coming back to is choice. From the very beginning, he said this election is a choice, and every time he talked about policy, it was a choice between this, a choice between that, and there's a reason for that. Obama doesn't poll that well when he's against a generic Republican candidate. When you put him against a specific candidate, when you put him against Mitt Romney, he takes the election is very close, and he takes a slight lead. And he really needs to make that point clear that you're not just kicking me out of office, you're putting the Republican Party in office. And considering how low congressional approval ratings are, that's probably a good tactic to take. There's a really strong populist streak, I thought, too. In this hyper-partisan era, you don't see as many independent voters, and middle-class voters have been, white voters, non-college educated voters, have been consistently moving away from the Democratic Party. I think he made a hard push for them today. I don't think he's giving up on that. You heard the bailouts emphasized, the auto bailouts emphasized over and over, both in Obama's speech and in Biden's speech. And these talks about returning American greatness and American middle class. So I would agree with what both of my colleagues on the panel said, that this was a good speech, better than Romney's, not the best speech he's ever given though, by a long stretch.
Watching that, it seemed like the Democrats there liked what they heard. How do you think, though, this is for the panel, how do you think this went down with just independent voters at home tuning in?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, this speech was aimed not simply to dole out the red meat for the base, but appealing to those crucial independents in those battleground swing states. Not just, we all hear about Florida and Ohio that really switched the balance of power in 2000 and 2004, but also Virginia, and New Hampshire, Colorado, Wisconsin, Michigan, New Mexico, New Hampshire, among others. These independents in these states will determine this election. I don't know how they would have responded. I think it was a more optimistic tone from many of the other speeches in this campaign. What struck me about this campaign and this convention over the last 2 to 3 days, I felt that the Democrats were angrier than they needed to be, whereas I felt the Republicans last week were pointing out Obama's weaknesses more in sorrow than in anger. And I think you have to remember independents are fairly middle-of-the-road people. They don't want to be yelled at. They want to have a conversation. And so my sense is that this speech was a nice contrast from much of the angry tone set during the course of the convention.
I mean, Biden's speech was, I thought, had a slightly angry tone, probably angrier than maybe some viewers at home would want, who might find Biden annoying to begin with. But but I thought that this argument you're making about are you better off than you were 4 years ago, that's going to be played out in the press, I think, by the Republicans over again with the kinds of figures Tom has presented. And I think the Democrats' initial response will obviously be, okay, the House would have been burnt to the ground if Obama hadn't have acted in the way that he did in early 2009 on financial issues, on the stimulus. But the Democrats have got to tell a story about how they rebuild the House, about how they're going to build an economy which is going to have a lot of jobs, it's going to provide more jobs. And that's the challenge that Obama hasn't, thus far, I think, been that effective at doing. And I think there's a book by Bob Woodward that's going to come out next week, and I think this kind of rolling set of arguments around this issue of saying Obama was an incredible orator in the 2008 campaign, but he hasn't been that effective at explaining his economic policies on both employment issues, on debt issues, and this is, I think, where the campaign is kind of stuck to some degree. I mean, the contrast with Romney, I think, will be constantly made an argument for fairness against something seen as unfair. But in this case of how do you actually create jobs in the type of economy the United States now has? And to talk about manufacturing, I think is all well and good, but it's just one part of the solution. And I think for those of us interested in policy, a little more detail there needs to be fleshed out. And the Democrats were actually caught pretty flat-footed on this issue on the weekend on the American talk shows when asked this very question of, well, why hasn't the economy bounced back as much as you might have promised? They tended to have 3 or 4 different answers, all of them starting, well, it was Bush's problem, and they're not quite sure where to go from there.
One of the problems I think President Obama has, and you'll hear this in the course of the next 2 months, is that during the early part of 2009, he went on the talk show circuits and said that if I don't turn this thing around, meaning the economy, in the next 3 to 4 years, I will be a one-term president. And that will come back to haunt him. You'll see that a lot in these negative attack ads that will be launched in the next few weeks in those battleground states. It's hard to respond to that in a convincing, compelling manner in this relentless 24/7 media and internet environment. So he will be on the back foot on that key question, I think.
There was certainly he tried to talk about his accomplishments, but is Tom right? Is that overriding question going to is that going to override anything Obama tries to mention in terms of things he's accomplished? Look.
It certainly hurts him. Tom's right about that. I think it was David Smith who said there's so much blame to go around here, though. People are upset with Obama's performance, but they're also very upset with the Bush administration. They understood how we got here. So I think the tone he's taking here of the long road, the more difficult road, is the right one to take. And I think it's generally a healthy one for the country as a whole to not have these sort of lofty rhetoric or unlikely promises to say this is a tough journey we're traveling, but we're going to do it together. He's really made a message about, I mean, even though there weren't as many specific policies here, he seems like he's really driving home a message about changing the direction of the country, changing the way they think about education, the way they think about energy, all of these broad issues. And so while there aren't as many policy specifics, it's a very broad campaign message in terms of everything he wants to do.
I'll ask this to the entire panel. As Tom says, this was perhaps less critical of his Republican opponents than other speeches at the Democratic convention have been, but Romney and Ryan didn't get off unscathed. How did the attacks on Republicans sit with you guys? Brendon?
I think there was this constant contrast to say that the Republican approach of limited government, of low taxes, of a much more of a free enterprise system, of blaming the government for nearly anything that goes wrong, has been tried and it's failed. That model has been given a go, and that model has led America to the worst financial crisis and economic crisis since the Great Depression. What Obama presents as the alternative, what he says is, well, what America would be better off with, the kind of 2 visions he's presenting, isn't entirely apparent. I mean, whether it's a vision that wants to go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and say the Democratic Party stands for a kind of Keynesian liberal tradition of politics, he's not quite there. He's a little bit closer to that than Bill Clinton, who was much more for a kind of, well, let's split the difference on a more market approach or a more traditional Democratic Party approach. So although Obama, I think, is clearly tagging Romney as a kind of Reaganite Republican or a Republican who's very much an anti-government person, this vision of what he's doing himself, I think is a little bit murky. And this is why I find this argument that this is the most important election in a generation or people's lifetimes a little bit hard to take, because this is what politicians tend to say every time round. And actually, given the Democrats are still struggling to work out what their own position is, and given the Congress will probably block anything anyway that's particularly grand, maybe the election result in fact matters less than this kind of rhetoric sets it up as these kind of two worlds of totally different ideologies against each other.
Anyone else want to comment?
Well, on the one hand, as I said before, I think that President Obama he presented sounder arguments on the question of foreign policy, albeit it was only relatively brief, than his Republican opponent. But I would disagree with Brendon slightly. I do think that in many respects, Romney, and especially Ryan, like the Tea Party generally, distinguish themselves not just from Barack Obama's let government solve it liberalism, as they would put it, but also the President Bush and the congressional Republican agenda throughout much of that post 9/11 period. The party of Reagan during the Bush years was the don't rock the boat party, content to feed different types of pork to different constituencies. They, if anything, increased the size of government through various entitlement programs and, of course, big spending programs. Ryan and the Tea Party are just as much against the old-style George W. Bush Republicans as they are with the Obama Democrats. And their goal is to reform the economy, reform institutions, and they recognise that entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are on an unsustainable trajectory, and if they're not fixed, the government will go bankrupt. That's the Ryan Tea Party message. Now, last week, Romney, in his major speech, was keen to downplay that because he's not himself a bold reformer. He's a technocrat, he's a cautious politician. But Ryan and the Republican base want to make this election one fundamentally about philosophy. So does Obama. That's why I disagree with Brendon. I think this is a very important election for that reason. It's about the size and the scope of the federal government. And Romney, because he's so cautious, doesn't really want to have that debate. But in the platform, and if you listen to Ryan on the hustings, it'll all come down to how to reform these welfare entitlement programs. And that's why I think that these Republicans at least, are different from George W. Bush. They can't be necessarily blamed for the stuff-ups during the 2000s as they are being portrayed.
I guess I would take issue with that a little, in that, I mean, they want to cut taxes for the wealthy, just like you had under the Bush administration, and they say the law said it by closing tax loopholes and deductions, but they don't specify at all what those are going to be. And so that doesn't sound to me like strict fiscal responsibility. And you're right about entitlement programs. They're willing to cut that, but Republicans have never been a fan of entitlement programs to begin with, and they're not proposing any cuts to the military budget. So I'd say the big difference would be that they're talking more about entitlement programs, but everything else doesn't seem that drastically different.
Yeah, I suppose my point is that if you look at some of the really big issues in the United States, such as, I mean, the medical expense issue to me strikes me as just constantly this huge problem. The United States is spending about 18% of its gross domestic product on medical expenses or healthcare. Most European states and Australia spending somewhere between 8% and 10%. So this cost is incredibly out of control, and it's not just to do with Medicare and Medicaid, it's much bigger than that. And both of the parties in some ways have this inability to address these issues because of a closeness to doctors or insurance companies or to the elderly in some constituencies. So that's where I think some of these kind of false polarizations occur. There's these crucial issues for the United States to think about, and we get this fairly inevitable kind of partisan rendering of them, which gets people excited and they believe that the government's going to be cut drastically. But the inability to do anything in Congress on these issues, apart from often just pontificate, means that I'm less sort of convinced that this really is an election where the fate of the United States hangs in one direction and things will be dramatically different thereafter.
Tom mentioned before that the unemployment rate currently stands at 8.3%, and that we're going to see new jobs figures this evening. This election is going to be about jobs, whether Barack Obama wants it to be or not. Did he have enough to say about jobs tonight? Luke.
Yeah, I mean, he made the pitch, but I still think it was a little bit too vague. And so I think the jobs issue here is really going to be the key issue as we come down the stretch. But at the same time, even though the economy isn't growing rapidly, it's still growing slowly enough that it makes it a close election. The fundamentals of the economy say this should be a close election, and it will. So I think what it's really going to come down to is who can sell their pitch in better terms. Republicans can run on the things aren't good enough, but they have trouble articulating a clear, articulate vision of what's different. And that's why you hear Obama keep on harping on the trickle-down economics and the policies of Bush and Reagan, because he wants to point out what their alternative plans are. If they're going to make the election a referendum on Obama's economic performance, he wants to make it a choice between his economic performance and generic Republican policies.
Yeah, well, look, the unemployment rate is 8.3%. It may go up a point, or go down a point tonight, as Jonathan alluded to with these jobs figures. But a bit of history, this has been branded around a lot. It's getting old, I suppose, but for those of you who aren't familiar with economic history, not since the Great Depression or 30s, early 40s, has an American president been re-elected when the unemployment rate is 7.4% or higher. The other point to bear in mind is that the recession, believe it or not, ended in the second quarter of 2009. A recession, of course, is 2 quarters of negative growth. This is the most sluggish economic recovery since the Depression. And, people are in a foul mood. And I'm not sure, from what I heard at least, that the president proposed the right ideas. But look, to be fair, I don't know if Romney did either last week. Look, there's gridlock in Washington. And my suspicion is that there'll be more rancor and a gridlock whoever wins this election. Of course, if the Republicans gain control of the Senate and maintain the House and there's a Republican White House, that could change. But bear in mind, the first 6 years of President Bush had Republicans dominating the legislature as well. And that's when a lot of these problems took place. So, look, it's a pessimistic outlook, whoever wins the election. But I do think the unemployment issue is the driving factor. And neither Obama nor Romney really spelled out much in their 2 speeches in the course of the last week.
I mean, Bill Clinton's speech was probably the best on this issue. I mean, Clinton had a total sort of number of jobs created by Democratic presidents and a total number created by Republican presidents since John F. Kennedy. And, not surprisingly, the Democratic total was higher. Clinton also, I think, made that effective argument that government deficits under Democratic presidents had been much lower as well, or that the ability to reduce deficits had been much greater under Democrats. It's also interesting, a point Tom's made a couple of times, that Obama goes into this election seen more favourably on foreign policy. That contrast with the Republicans is quite extraordinary. Republicans usually have amongst the public a more favourable rating on foreign policy. So the fact that Obama has not just neutralised that issue, but got an advantage,
Double digits.
is a tremendous turnaround. I mean, Democrats as deficit hawks, as strong on foreign policy, Republicans something else. The problem is the election isn't going to be fought on foreign policy for Obama. So this great advantage isn't as important as it might have been at another time.
Well, since I gave you the opening word, Brendon, I'll be unfair and allow you the last word. Why don't we open it up to questions now? Yes, lady up the back there.
I had one question, but I have several comments, and I kind of wonder if we were watching the two gentlemen on the right, I feel like we weren't even watching the same event. And I am American, and I've been through a lot of elections. I guess the main thing is I would agree with you that it seemed like it was a fairly lackluster speech. It was fairly low key, and I don't know if that's important or not. I don't know
I'd say,
So anyway,
yeah.
let me finish, please.
Yeah.
You had your
Did
chance.
you have a question?
So I just want to say that I thought that the anger ticked off a very good box at trying to grab the people that put Obama in the White House and become disillusioned and are becoming more leftists of the Democratic Party now. And also I think that Biden did a very good service. I think he provides sort of a gravitas and a history and definitely time, and I thought he did very well, and by connection Obama did, with connecting with those that Luke mentioned, the undecided, the lower middle classes, the white, uneducated people, because they kept harping on the military, they kept harping on the pride in the military, veterans issues, they kept harping on Osama bin Laden to grab that military, which is primarily an uneducated, blue-collar, lower middle class. It's been an avenue for the middle class.
I think this is a reasonable point, but just picking up on that, could I get the panel to comment on Biden's speech quickly? What did you guys, I mean...
Well, I'm just not quite finished yet.
we just, it's just, we have, I'm sure there are more questions to get to, and...
Possibly. Well, I mean, the panel, you're not opening up to other questions, you're opening up back to the panel, so.
Did you want to ask a, did you want to ask a question of the panel?
Yes, I did. My question is, would you at least, how do you feel about whether Obama made any brownie points, perhaps, for consistency? Because that's what I picked up, is that he's been consistent on education, the environment, solar energy, alternative energy, getting off of foreign oil. He's been very consistent on that, and it was brought up that Mitt Romney is a flip-flopping with fish.
Consistency.
What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's right. I made the point that his second-term agenda, from what I could tell this evening, reflects in many respects his first-term agenda. A go-for-broke pursuit of progressive social legislation, more power to the state. But look, a word of caution. In early 2009, when Obama won a very convincing election, most convincing election result since probably Reagan in '84, he had huge super majorities of Democrats in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the conventional wisdom in Washington was that this would lead to a political realignment in Washington, and that the Republicans were an endangered species, according to a front cover of Time magazine. Well, what happened within 2 years? You had huge Republican gains in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I interpret that as, in some respects, not just a reflection of the anger in America about the state of the economy, but also a sense that he may have overreached on some of these issues. I think we should always remember that America is a centre-right country. All the available public opinion polling evidence demonstrates that when people identify themselves ideologically, 40% would say they're conservative, only 20% would say they're liberal. Now, in a centre-right country, and you're putting forward a big government, interventionist, liberal agenda, and he has described himself on more than a few occasions as a transformational president that's going to realign the political system, wind back not just Bush and Reagan, but also Clinton. He said that on the campaign trail in 2008. You're going to meet a backlash. So as a liberal Democrat partisan, I think one should bear in mind that these ideals that Biden perhaps represented don't represent middle America necessarily.
I suppose I disagree with Tom on this front. I mean, I think Obama's sort of weakness to some extent is this need to compromise, particularly that we saw at various times in his kind of career, in his book, The Audacity of Hope, but I think we see it in his policies in the early part of his administration, and that it would have been risky to be bolder in 2009. It would have been risky to take the argument more up to the Republicans and to use Bush in the way that Roosevelt had used Hoover in the 1930s as a target constantly to argue for change. But it would have reaped possibly greater rewards. Electorally, we know what kind of coalition eventually Roosevelt was able to establish in the 1930s, one that lasted for the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives pretty much to the 1990s. So boldness would have come with, Fox News wouldn't have been happy, but I think that it would have come possibly with great rewards. Obama isn't that type of character. He's a character, I think, who's much more drawn to compromise. My animosity to Biden to some extent was reinforced this morning by reading extracts from Bob Woodward's new book. And one of them, Biden makes a statement to Eric Cantor, a very senior Republican, that if he was president, he would have solved the debt crisis. And this just strikes me as very typical of Joe Biden, that he's supposed to be a loyal deputy, but there seems no problem that he can't solve or thing that he doesn't know about. And I suppose, thinking from Obama's point of view, this is not exactly what you want out in the press. That your loyal deputy is, in some ways would have done a much better job than you. Now, I gave a speech which was incredibly loyal tonight, but behind the scenes, Obama, I think, on many occasions has had to kind of cover up for things that Biden has said on foreign policy, on domestic policy. So I don't see him as one of the great vice presidents of all time.
Just quickly, Woodward is a very influential writer. To what extent do you think Woodward's book will have an impact in the next 2 months?
Well, a lot of sales. I mean, people will be very interested in this guy. I mean, whether it's true or not, you've got to always, with Woodward, you've got to ask yourself. But he has access like no one else at the moment. And his Bush books was similarly important.
Any more questions? Yes, sir. In the yes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Do you think that the Democrats' pitch today was sufficient to retain and maintain votes that they got from the mainstream voters of the election, especially the Hispanics and the Catholics?
I don't think it's sufficient to retain all of the votes that they got. They don't need to retain all the votes they got. They won by an overwhelming majority in 2008. But the issue of voter turnout is so important. I can't overemphasize it enough. Tom is right that more Americans describe themselves as conservative right now, but more Americans identify as Democrat than Republican. And surveys amongst likely voters are always much better. All registered voters are much better for Obama than likely voters. There's lower enthusiasm amongst Democrats than there was in either 2004 or 2008. If it's a high turnout election, Obama's going to win. If it's a low turnout election, it's going to be very close, and Romney could very easily become the next president.
Next question. Yes, sir. In the blue shirt up the back there.
Just very quickly, if the unemployment rate doesn't go down, will that advantage Tom?
Probably, yeah. You can bet your bottom dollar Republicans are hoping that unemployment figure tonight goes up. It's a sad state of affairs in politics.
What about
But,
stays the same?
I don't think that helps Obama. Look, 8.3 is very high for a country like America with a very liberal labour market. 3 years out of a recession, as I say, it's the most sluggish economic recovery since the Great Depression. These are bad figures.
Remember, though, it's not the actual number that matters as much as the direction things are moving and whether people think it's moving in the right direction or not. The absolute number is less important.
Yes, in the striped button up.
Just with the lead-up speeches, what was needed by the lead-up speeches for both parties? Who delivered, and what is the consequences for the rest of the election from those speeches?
Well, I was impressed by Bill Clinton's speech, as I think a lot of people were. I mean, that speech, the reception amongst fairly cynical American journalists that it received overnight was overwhelming, tick and overwhelmingly positive. Michelle Obama's speech, similarly, I thought she spoke very well, and she obviously a lot more confident and comfortable as a speaker than she was in 2008, where I think she was reluctant to some extent about the whole journey, about the whole business of Barack Obama seeking the presidency. So I think that created a degree of energy. And my sense is there'll be a little bump for the Democrats, so things will be back to where they were 2 weeks ago before the conventions, that Obama will come out of this with the whole lineup. And in retrospect, it looks like this convention was a lot more about re-electing Barack Obama than the Republican convention, where both Marco Rubio and Chris Christie really seemed to launch their 2016 campaigns and talked about themselves largely rather than about Romney. So I think as a package, it does a much better job than the Republican package.
I agree. To some extent, Bill Clinton, I think, tells Barack Obama's story better than the president himself. It was a bit rambling and it went on for 50 odd minutes in classic Clinton style, but it was a very good speech, and I think the conventional wisdom is right to praise it. However, I would remind you all that exactly 20 years ago, it was mid-August of 1992, at a Republican convention, when another president was up for re-election at a time of economic malaise, and that was George H.W. Bush, and another popular former president, Ronald Reagan, got on the stage on primetime television and gave a great speech. He hit it out of the ballpark, and the conventional wisdom was almost the same as it is right now about Bill Clinton's speech. Ultimately, though, Reagan's stirring speech did not help George H.W. Bush. Key difference, though, between Reagan in '92 and Bill Clinton today. Reagan physically was on the way down. He didn't campaign as much. He was obviously a lot older. Clinton, right now, is on the battleground states. He's campaigning very hard for Romney. He'll be featuring in a lot of advertisements for Obama. And, of course, he's a brilliant campaigner. If anyone's seen him on the ground, he touches you in a way that not many politicians can. He feels your pain in more ways than one. And he will be a brilliant campaigner on the ground, and that may well have some impact. But the speech itself, I don't think one should overstate the significance of the speech, just like Reagan's in '92.
Could I get a question from the lady in the US?
It's not a question, I just wanted to add to this, because I think the speeches over the week were stagecraft. They were brilliant, and they were managed all the way through from the beginning when the women took the stage and Michelle Obama. And we forgot to mention the Castro brothers, because I think that they really did do a good job to solidify that part of the American community and to present the message as well.
Yeah, I mean, the dream of Texas.
Yeah.
You can take,
yeah.
I mean, the Democrats can get control of the electoral college votes in Texas. They've got New York for the next 50 years probably, and California, Texas. You know, the Republicans are going to want to rewrite the electoral rules, electoral colleges.
The last time Democrats won Texas was in '64 with LBJ, is that right? But of course, the demography is changing dramatically. As you know, there's a very significant Hispanic community.
And also, I think that the recent judicial ruling that said that the way that they had changed the boundaries for the elections is also significant. So I don't know how they're going to manage that, because they've already done all their primaries. I don't
Yeah,
know.
but it's one thing. Texas will remain a red state for this election. I don't think anyone.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm sure for
Sure.
Yes, sir.
I thought the point you made about bringing back the jobs was pretty hollow, really. I thought it was perhaps a bit of a shot at China. And I thought if he was meaning bringing back some of those manufacturing jobs, I doubt whether he'd be able to do it, because I think Asia does that sort of work better and cheaper.
Well, in fairness to President Obama, he could claim with some justification that his bailout package of the automobile industry saved a lot of jobs. And that's haunted Romney, because his classic Romney style has been all over the place on his own position on the bailout of the automobile industry. But your broader point is quite right. I think both sides of politics, both Republicans and Democrats, often take pot shots at China, especially on its manipulation of the currency, and they see that as placing their workers at an unfair disadvantage.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating point. I mean, General Motors has really grown in the last couple of years, and it has been a bit of a success story under the Obama presidency. But, you know, about a year or two ago, about 40% to 45% of all corporate profits in America today come from the financial sector. Now, that sector can't be talked about, because what went on in 2008, it's assumed every American either turns up to a small business, if you hear the Republican convention, or maybe wears a hard hat or works in a manufacturing plant, if you listen to the Democrat convention. That's not the case. I mean, most Americans are working in retail or service, or, you know, in the corporate world, finance is crucial. And they don't have a narrative for that reality, basically, of a global economy. So we deal in the sort of realm of fairy tales to some extent in these conventions, is my broader point about the kind of real issues often. We need narratives for them, and these are pretty effective narratives, but I don't always think that they're that representative.
Luke, are those three words made in America, are they hollow ones?
Yeah, I mean, Brendon says they play well, so I guess you have to use them. But it is funny in these elections about how much you love capitalism and how great the free enterprise system is. Both candidates are as protectionist as you possibly can be, and it's, I don't know, that part of the speech rang pretty hollow to me. It probably plays well to middle America, but it's not really saying anything meaningful in terms of getting the economy back on track.
Yes, sir, off the back.
Well, I was just going to say on that point, Brendon, you raised it earlier, the question of fairness, and then Luke, you mentioned it about choice. I mean, it seems to me that the point he was making wasn't about jobs, it was about values. And so if Jim Messina is right, and this is going to be a values election, how do you think this played as a values election choice versus Republicans?
I'm not sure if this exactly answers your question, but you reminded me of a point which I think is really important, is in Biden's speech, and then you heard it again in Obama's, is that a job is not just about making money. It's about pride and dignity in yourself and your community. And I think that's going to be a huge theme going forward. And without mentioning Romney by name, it's a clear shot at Bain Capital and capitalism, with sort of the bottom line is the only thing that matters. And I'm sure that the Democrats have tested these attacks and know that they play well. And I think it's a fair comment, and I think it's one that will resonate. So I'm sure you'll be seeing that more and more on the campaign trail.
I'm not so sure about the testing these attacks. I mean, this is what the Democratic Party has to stand for. It has to stand for a degree of fairness, to say we're all in it together. It can exaggerate and say the Republicans are all out for themselves and sort of Ayn Rand-like individualists. But that contrast is a pretty central one to what the two parties believe they stand for. Now, the Republicans are going to exaggerate that the Democrats are kind of near to some form of socialism. But that values divide does seem to me to be what the election, the rhetoric of the election will fall back to. And that's quite different to 2008 to some extent. 2008 was about much loftier, kind of once in a generational kind of messages about hope and change. And you can't really get away with that too often. Your opponents really have to stuff up to be really pitching that high. So I think it's come back to really what the parties generally talk about in most elections. And unfortunately, from my point of view, the fairness argument is often the one that loses at the presidential level. It's often the argument of, well, let's cut taxes and, look after individuals a little more. So I think it's interesting that Obama making this fairness case is having to, that's a hard road to some extent. He's got to make a case that has often been a losing argument in American politics at the presidential level.
How about I take one more question? No one?
I got a
Question?
This is an economic question, so if you're all political pundits, you may not want to answer it. But one of the things that I noticed that really disturbed me, and noticed in terms of statistics that disturbed me, was the trillions of dollars that are made in the United States, which are lodged offshore and put into offshore accounts. Now, I know that money goes into offshore accounts and is invested overseas, but the number trillions is what really disturbed me, because if the economy is lagging and American people and American corporations are taking that much money out of the economy, that money should be in American banks, where it can be used as loans to people who need those loans to start businesses, to stimulate the economy. And that money should also be taxed in America, so that then goes back into the system again. Can you make a comment about that? Am I just, am I reading this correctly?
No, I mean, maybe I'm being way too over-optimistic here, but right after the election, at the end of the year, we're going to have the fiscal cliff, where a whole bunch of tax cuts expire and a whole bunch of spending expires as well. And so I think we have a huge opportunity here to rewrite the tax code. And I know there's so many special interests here, but we talk a lot about the differences between Democrats and Republicans. There's some common ground on how complex and bizarre the tax code is. Democrats want to simplify it. They talk about how it favors the wealthy. And even Republicans and sort of libertarians say we could lower all rates but still have the same revenue if we just stop having these bizarre loopholes. And so I'm holding my breath. I'd like there to be some actual progress on this when they come to negotiations before the fiscal cliff, I'm not sure if it'll end up happening.
Look, I don't want to gas bag too much, but I would point you to a very highly acclaimed book that was published about a year ago, That Used to Be Us, by the distinguished foreign affairs commentator Michael Brendon and the New York Times columnist Thomas Freedman, who's a friend of the centre. They actually deal with this very question in a chapter. And more recently, the Wall Street Journal published an editorial that deals with this question, and it published some survey results from the US-China Business Council, which merely is an association, a lobby group for American corporations doing business in China. But nevertheless, it found survey evidence that showed overwhelmingly all those American politicians, both Republican and Democrats, who make these kind of arguments about China, saying America should get tougher on these issues, they represent constituencies that benefit overwhelmingly by a close China-US relationship, and that means a lot of these issues you were talking about. So there is a lot of data to counter for the counter argument, but again, I'd point you to Mandelbaum and Freedman, which is very good on the subject.
Brendon, would you like the last word?
I think I've had enough words.
All right, we'll end on that wonky note then. Thank you all for coming.